Built during the 17th century by French monarch Louis XIII and completed by his son Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles serves as not just a landmark, but as one of France's most notable works of art. Covering over 2,000 acres or 87 million square feet, the cottage-turned-castle is the world's largest royal domain. The palace is located 12 miles southwest of Paris in the city of Versailles. With its 700 rooms and 67 staircases, Versailles can hold up to 20,000 people indoors alone. The most significant parts of the palace include the Hall of Mirrors, home to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, King and Queen's grand apartments, royal opera, chapel, and gardens. The palace was built in a style common to France at the time, using dramatic, rich, and contrasting designs to display power and wealth. This comes at no surprise considering Versailles' modern-day price tag approaches $300 billion. You could say that Louis XIV was probably feeling pretty baroque after financing such a monument.
The history of the Palace of Versailles begins in 1607 with the young Dauphin, Louis XIII. Louis XIII and his father visited the woods of Versailles in August of that year for Louis's first hunting trip. They were both impressed by the amount of game in the area, and Louis XIII became fascinated. He would return 10 years later in 1617, now as king, and enjoyed the place even further. By 1623, Louis XIII had begun construction on a small hunting lodge for him to escape to in the woods of Versailles. But this place would be rebuilt 8 years later into the foundations of the modern palace. That we know today was not truly expanded upon or built on until the reign of his son, Louis XIV. Louis XIV visited the Palace of Versailles for the second time at age 13 in 1651. By 1661, he was fascinated and began the major work to the palace to expand it into the masterpiece of the 17th century. In 1682, Louis XIV moved the French court to Versailles and it became the main residence of the court, government, aristocracy, and most of his advisors and administrators. Construction continued all the way until Louis XIV's death in 1715, and every monarch after until the Revolution 1789 built upon this and kept improving the palace. Over 50 years and 100 million livres, which was the historic French currency until the early 1790s, which is estimated today to be between $200 and $300 billion. Versailles was abandoned for any royal purpose after the Revolution in 1789 until 1837 when King Louis Philippe transformed the Palace of Versailles into the Museum of History of France.
French monarchs living at Versailles experienced a pampered but highly organized and public lifestyle. The daily schedule for kings remained mostly the same for all days of the week, beginning with a grand morning ritual. After being woken up at 8:30, the king would first be visited by a doctor to check his health, and then be bathed, clothed, and fed. All of this took place in front of a 100 noble entourage who viewed the spectacle solely for pleasure. Next, the king walked down the hall to his very own chapel and attended mass for half an hour. Between 11 and 1 is when the king would perform most of his duties. He would meet with councils to discuss financial, religious, and national affairs, and several ministers would also work with him as a board of trustees. Until 6, the king was free to do whatever he wished on the massive property. Hunting was especially popular among the monarchs. After that, the king would sign paperwork with his secretaries of state before repeating the morning ritual and going to bed.
Well, because of Versailles' massive size, there was constantly between 3,000 and 10,000 people milling around the palace daily, and that always made for a very lively environment. It was the nobles' main goal to strike favor with the king. There was a very strict etiquette and many rules about who could approach who, especially when it came to high-ranking members and members of the royal family. Depending on their rank, these high-ranking members and members of the royal family would have apartments overlooking the gardens, and those lesser known would be in the palace outbuildings, such as the stables. These courtiers had strict rules and duties, and their roles were usually inherited or could be bought for a really high price. with monarch approval, of course. Nobilities constantly attended to the king, because that was the best way to gain favor. However, court appearances were nearly just as important. The nobility set themselves apart with their individual talents to impress the king, and this purposeful position of the nobility gave even more power to the crown, because the nobility felt they were serving him. These nobles who had the money would buy their own houses outside of the palace in the town of Versailles as somewhere to retreat after a court. Constant tourist frenzy and large court always occupied the days at the chateau.
The motives behind Louis XIV's expansion of Versailles likely ended at a desire to show off his nation's wealth. Considering the competitive nature of the time that was fueled by the era of exploration, it's no wonder that he felt justified in spending so much. French citizens didn't mind the creation of Versailles during his reign because France was in a prosperous state and Louis XIV was one of their most accomplished leaders. It wasn't until the French Revolution began to build that Versailles met serious opposition. The citizens of Paris saw the palace as a retreat away from the suffering poor that made it easier for the king to be ignorant. It didn't help that the monarch lived in a 3-square-mile palace during a time of extreme poverty. Eventually, peasants marched on Versailles and chased Louis XVI and his nobles out in 1789. The palace was never again used as France's center of government and instead became a museum for several decades.
Since 1837, the Palace of Versailles, under King Louis Philippe, was transformed into the Museum of History of France to display all of the glories that the French people had to offer. This museum was built for all of the public to see, and unfortunately there was a brief moment in which Versailles closed in World War I, but thanks to 2 large donations from across the Atlantic, J.D. Rockefeller, the palace was able to be restored. Contrary to popular belief, the palace was a very open place ever since the reign of Louis XIV, in which people could pay to visit as long as dress code was followed. Today, you can take guided tours of the palace, the gardens, the stables, and the estate of Trianon, in which that is where Napoleon stayed, and it was built under Louis XIV as well. The memory of Versailles goes down as one of the masterpieces of the 17th century, with its reputation of its extraordinary display of wealth and luxury to all. The Palace of the Sun King truly exemplifies the magnificence of what the French monarchy was, reflecting the key ideas of absolutism from its power and opulence, but still large enough to maintain a distance from the outside world. And as Marie Antoinette would say, life was a cakewalk at Versailles.